Hi everybody, this is Maureen Wong with mycasestudies.blogspot.com. Today I'm going to make for you this card. It says, "You're pretty darn awesome," and if you can see from the side here, this panel is mounted with foam tape, but yet the sentiment still lines up perfectly from the card base to the watercolor panel. And I'm actually going to show start to finish the card, and one thing to note is that I'm going to be using the new MISTI stamping tool, which I just got, and so I hope that's going to be a bit of interest to you. If you haven't heard of it, it'll be informative, and maybe you'll want to get one for yourself. So let's get started. So to get started, I'm going to make the watercolor background for the roses, and I've chosen picked raspberry, spiced marmalade, and squeezed lemonade distress inks. My watercolor paper is 2 1/8 inch wide by 5.5 inches tall, and I'm using hot press watercolor paper. You can use others, but I found that the cold press kind of soaked up the colors too fast, so that's why I'm using hot press instead. Now I'm doing that smooshing technique. You've probably seen it, but if you haven't, you want to put your colors pretty close but not touching because you don't want to contaminate your ink pads. And then you generously spritz water all over that, and then place your watercolor paper in there and kind of smush it around a little bit to make sure you get good coverage of your paper. And that looks pretty good, except I think there's a little bit too much of the marmalade in the picked raspberry portion, so I'm going to dab that off. And I'm also going to dab off a little in the marmalade section too, and then that looks better to me. But the yellow is not dark enough, so I'm going to put that back in the yellow, and that looks a little better to me. So I'm going to take my tweezers and my heat gun and heat that until it's dry. Then I'm going to go ahead and clean off my Ranger craft mat, and I've die cut some roses using the roses die from Paper Smooches out of black and white polka dot cardstock from Amuse Studio. And what I'm doing right now off camera is getting my spray box, and I am taking the 3 roses outlines die cuts and spraying the back of them with spray adhesive. And when that's all done, then I can take them out and put them onto my watercolor panel one by one. Now that that's done, I'm going to take my card base, which is an A2 size card, and I'm checking to make sure, and yes, it is an A2 size card base, and I'm going to be stamping across of that area that I'm pointing to, but to get it to go over that bump where the watercolor paper ends, I'm going to need to use my MISTI stamping tool so that I can stamp the entire sentiment on the base cardstock, and then just the partial sentiment on the watercolor paper. So what I'm doing here is, since I want to mount my watercolor paper to the right hand side of my card, I'm placing it downwards and wedging those both into the corner of the MISTI and holding them down with magnets. Then I'm going to get out my stamp from the Lovely Thoughts stamp set from Paper Smooches that says, "You're pretty darn awesome," and line it up where I want it to go. Sorry about my hair getting in the way. I pick it up on the cover, and when I look at the cover, there's the grid, and I can kind of line it up with the grid and fix it and make it a little bit straighter and double check that it's still going to stamp where I want it to. So I take off the watercolor panel, and I'm going to stamp with VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto the card base first. And then I'm going to put in the watercolor panel and make sure it's wedged in that corner where it started. Especially with this panel, because it's a little bit warped, you want to make sure it's held down. So you can tape it, but I just use magnets here, and make sure you have a piece of scratch paper to catch the overstamping. I'm going to ink that up again and stamp it down, concentrating on the watercolor panel. Make sure you get to the very edge of the watercolor panel, And there's your sentiment. And when you line up the watercolor panel on your card base, it is perfectly lined up. So I've stuck foam tape to the back of the watercolor panel, and I've been very generous with it so that it won't sag and so that it'll help keep it a little bit flatter because it is warped. What I'm going to do is just take off the middle strip of liner, and then I'm going to line that up with the edge of my card base and check and see that it's where I want it. And I think it's just a little bit crooked, so I'm going to adjust it to where I think it's really well aligned, and then that way my sentiment lines up perfectly, and I can peel off the other two liners for the foam tape. And there's your finished card. I hope you like my video and that you'll visit me over at mycasestudies.blogspot.com. Thanks for watching.